All right, Beth. It seems like it's that time of year again. You can
Yes.
good. You can hear me. And Lexi, you need to I guess mute your camera. Is that what it is? You gotta turn your camera on at least. All right, Beth. Oh, I need to mute that. Oh, got it.
Hey, part of the reason that the
Hey,
mic is muted is because of the very cranky toddler behind me.
that's okay, and feel free to leave if you have to. Folks, it is such a pleasure to be here with you again this year. Beth, what is this, like our fourth year doing this, maybe?
It's got to be. I think at least 4 years. Yeah.
Wow, right? And
Yeah,
last
you
year,
guys started doing this during the pandemic, so it's got to be at least four.
yeah, and Lexi came on last year and she volunteered to be our moderator, and I really appreciate that so much, Lexi. But like I said, please feel free to jump out as you need. Looks like your dog's trying to get a little snack there. Hello to everybody in the comments. It looks like we have a Mrs. Carson as a teacher who deserves a shout out, a Mrs. Bishop who deserves a shout out. I'm glad that someone else is here, that Jose is ready for this because, as I said, I am not. But that's not true. Beth, we're ready to go. And Alexi, make sure you chime in when you have something really excellent to say as well. Um, Good. Let's see. Who else do we have here? So we got some South Carolina, some New York. Um, what else? Did anybody else put anything else in there? Let's see. Um, and then someone asks about the if this is going to be recorded. Yes, these are recorded and they post right to our channel by the time they are done, or like within an hour. Which reminds me that we do have Coach Hall here, who is the one and only Beth Hall, but it's not on her channel. So we want to make sure we give her support. So if you look at the description down below this video, you will find a link to Coach Hall's channel, which will allow you to support her channel by just pressing the subscribe button. Beth, introduce yourself. I'll look here for some names to shout out. Lexi, you can feel free to do that too. And just know how much I appreciate you, and I'm excited for the next hour that we have together.
All right. Awesome. Well, hey, everybody. My name is Beth Hall. I go by Coach Hall Writes over on YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. So if you are looking for more AP Lang tips, definitely follow on those channels as well. And I am an AP Lang teacher from Arkansas. And Tim and I, like we said, we've been doing this for about probably 4 years now, just trying to give people tips as the exam approaches and things like that.
For sure. Now, just to set some ground rules for today, we encourage you to interact in the chat with us. Somebody just called me a nerd in the chat again. I am guilty as charged. There's no doubt about it. But anyway, nonetheless, some ground rules for today. First of all, we will happily give a shout out to your teachers, which I have to go back through and look at. I think I have Mrs. Ake right there, Union Pines, AP Langers, Mrs. Bishop again. LHS, I wish I knew. Mr. Dupree, Mr. Rye, Mr. Ritchie, like all of these awesome things. So we're happy to give your teacher a shout out, but just don't spam us, please, because if you just put tons of that in, Alexi's here to actually moderate that type of stuff to make sure that we can actually get real questions out for kids to answer and whatnot. The way that today's going to work, we're going to go over multiple choice reading strategies, and we're going to go over the beginning of rhetorical analysis strategies. And what to do in those types of papers. So please note, if you're like, hey, how do I write a synthesis? This might not be the best session for you. It might be our next session. If you're wondering about the dates when we're going to do YouTube lives again, if you look in the description of this video, you will see them there. We have April 10th, we have April 24th. And Beth, I do believe that you're going to be with me on April 10th, correct?
Yes, I just won't
Okay,
be there on the 24th. That one is
that's
actually
right.
with Katie, who is
That's
awesome.
right. Yes. So for those of you that tune in on the 24th, we're going to be looking predominantly at argument on the 24th of April. And that's going to be with Katie Storms. And she is absolutely fabulous. And when Beth was like, I'm not available, I'm like, I know exactly who to call. And then Lexi, I'm pretty sure will be with us almost every time, which we're appreciative about. Good. Mrs. Greer would be proud that Willie is here. So Mrs. Greer, I hope that you're proud. And did I have Ms. Dar? Oh, wait, Ms. Dar, that's you. So you have your students here. How awesome is that? And Sweetwater High School, shout out to you. Okay, did I miss Mrs. Bishop? Okay, so Mrs. Bishop, we'll make sure we get some love there too. We've got people from Florida and South Carolina and New York, and I haven't seen anywhere farther than the South yet, but I'm sure. Oh, Arkansas. Well, Beth, you're from Arkansas.
I saw
Yes.
China in the chat,
What?
actually.
China? Heck yes.
Yeah, there were
Oh
a
my
couple
gosh.
international students in the chat.
What? How did I miss that? I'm just such a jerk sometimes. Oh my goodness. Well, anyway, if you're tuning internationally, we appreciate you. But let's actually, oh, ENHS is in the house. I don't know what that stands for, but they're in the house, and I'm glad to know. And then, oh, Mrs. Mendoza. Yep, shout out to Mrs. Mendoza. There we go. Okay, cool. Now, Beth, let's actually start talking about this here. And folks, if you have questions about multiple choice or rhetorical analysis, feel free to put them in the chat. Lexi, if you could actually try to collect some of those and put them in our chat in our Zoom so that we can kind of get those focused while we also work in the chat, that would be great too.
Yes,
So,
sir, I'll be doing that.
Mrs. Whitmore, got to make sure we shout out to her too. But nonetheless, the way that this is going to work, Beth and I are going to give our tips. If you all have questions about like help with multiple choice or things like that, put those in here. But also know that we're going to talk through rhetorical analysis in the order of the way that points are awarded on the rubric. Okay, so we'll talk about like thesis statements, and then we'll talk about like evidence and commentary help, and we will talk about sophistication. But one thing that I've noticed that happens a lot is that kids really want to be like, how do I get the sophistication point? But really, correct me if I'm wrong, Beth, but kids shouldn't really even be thinking about that if they can't get at least a 130 on row A and row B anyway. Do you agree with that, Beth?
I do. I think a lot of people put too much focus on the sophistication point because it's a little bit harder. And I think there's a little bit of, clout in getting it maybe, but I don't think it's the best place for our attention. Not that we won't tell you how to earn it, but I think the evidence and commentary row is where most students need to be focusing right now.
I completely agree. And just so everybody knows, if you look in the description below this video, you will also notice that there is a free worksheet that has all of the tips that I've collected in the description. And Beth, if you have like a playlist and whatnot, and I'll show this a little later, and you have like a worksheet where this stuff is collected, I can put it in the description a little later too. Okay. So we have just real quick, we've got Mrs. Bishop. Oh, somebody asked about, I don't know if it's Ms. Spiz or Ms.
It might be Spies. I think last year they
Spies? Okay.
her out too.
I remember her being
Gotcha.
shouted out last year.
And one of my best AP Lang teacher friends just got shouted out in the chat, Miss Cuzzo. I know her.
Oh, yeah.
You know her
yes.
too, Tim. Yep, from
Yes,
New
I
Jersey.
do.
So if you're Miss Cuzzo's student, please tell her that Beth says hi.
Yep. And you could say that the Freitas jerk does too. All right, Beth. So here we go. We need to talk about multiple choice because a lot of times kids kind of struggle with that. And before we talk about like questions itself, let's actually talk about reading comprehension. Mm-hmm. What's some of the advice that you can give students when it comes to reading comprehension on the AP Lang exam? And then we'll talk about like kind of doing the narrowing down answers and whatnot in a little bit. But reading comprehension, what can you do?
Well, I think the first thing I tell my students is that we want to make sure that we're going into it with the right mindset, because I think sometimes when my students see a difficult passage, like if they see that it was written in the 1800s or something, they immediately feel defeated. And I think we need to teach students to believe in themselves and realize you can understand this. And even some of the hardest passages I have found that I've given my students, I've had them just kind of start with step one. What is the passage about? And I know that seems like a really silly question, but quite literally, what is the passage about? What are they talking about? Because we have to understand what's going on. And I also tell my students that they don't need to necessarily understand every single word. And so, because I think sometimes students get caught up in like, oh, I don't know what this word means or whatever. And honestly, yes, there could be some questions about certain words in context, but we want to maybe read it through and kind of pause after each paragraph or so and say, okay, what is going on here? Like, what am I noticing? What's it about? Am I noticing any shifts or any rhetorical choices? Just kind of getting a lay of the land. And I have some students that tend to read more slowly and they annotate more, and that's their strategy. But then I have other students who actually like to read through it once kind of quickly to see what's going on. And then they read it a second time. And that time is when they feel like they're better attuned to what's happening. So I feel like students need to find an approach for them. But I think my first tip is don't freak out. Like, don't worry about if it's an old passage or if you've heard of the author before, because I think sometimes people get so worked up that they almost like take themselves out of it for a second. And you got to give yourself a little bit more credit than that.
Absolutely. I tell my kids all the time, you cannot go in defeated, right? if you're taking AP Lang, you've read something before in your life. Now, it doesn't mean that you're the best reader ever, but you've read something. And if there are words on the page, then we want to do that. Also, I do see the shout out to Mr. Unamuno. I think that's how you would say that. That's my best guess. If I botched that or butchered it, please let me know. And then Mrs. Knight as well. But nonetheless, Beth, one of the things that I also really appreciated that you just brought up about the reading comprehension side of things is the idea of marking shifts. Okay, I have written many multiple choice questions in my life in relation to producing my own exam prep materials and for stuff for perfection learning. And I've worked with a lot of multiple choice questions from the College Board. And one of the things that I've noticed a lot is that when I'm writing questions, most of my questions typically come from where there is a shift. And I'm like, oh, there's a shift here, so I can write a question about that because it's incredibly noticeable. So one of the things that you want to look at, shout out to Ms. Brown. One of the things that you want to look at is where those shifts are, because if you even mark those while you're reading, even if you don't make a note about it, besides the fact that you just note that there's a shift in between those lines, chances are there's going to be a multiple choice question that is derived from that particular shift because it's so important. One other thing too about the reading comprehension side of things is I have a friend who writes multiple choice, and he says every time that I've written a multiple choice question, whether it be for the College Board or whether for any other company, he said, if I find a sentence that has a delicious subordinated conjunction, you better believe that I'm writing a multiple choice question about it. And so if you think about this, folks, as you're reading something, if you see a subordinated conjunction like the word because or like the word although, then know that that might be a good place to kind of just be like, okay, there might be a question about this, because a lot of questions come from those major shifts and those areas of subordination. Shout out to Mr. Lynch, shout out to Ms. Brown, things like that. Beth, anything else about reading comprehension before I give a couple other tips in relation to it? I'm going to share my screen about it too, actually.
I think one thing to clarify is when we say look for shifts, one of the easiest ways to do this, at least in my opinion, is to look for yet, but, or however, because those are the words that tend to indicate a shift. So I make my students like underline it or circle it whenever we read a passage in class that has that. I'm like, okay, there's a shift here. So anytime they see yet, but, or however, and so that's a really good place to start. If you feel like you're unsure if there's a shift, look for those words.
Yeah, shout out to Mr. McMahon too. Sorry, Beth, I had to just interject that there. I saw it just pop up, and Mr. Asbury. So another thing too that I wanted to just mention here is that somebody asked the question, do I think it's better to skip the harder passages and come back later? What do you do, Beth? Then I'm going to give my advice in relation to that.
Okay, so it kind of depends on the student what I would recommend, but in general, I have come to view this as a strategic opportunity. That's where like kind of like the coach in me. I used to coach high school soccer for several years. And one of the things that I want my students to understand is there are 45 questions and you have 60 minutes to answer them. So they're all worth 1 point each. And I say that because the multiple choice is 45% of your composite score. So the easiest question is 1 point, the hardest question is 1 point. So think of it like a game. You're trying to earn as many points as possible. So again, this advice might vary depending on the student, but in general, I tell my students who are maybe struggling with multiple choice to prioritize what they do well. And I know students who would spend maybe 20 minutes on a really hard passage and maybe would only get half of them right. But in those 20 minutes, they maybe could have answered like the 3 writing MCQ passages and maybe they would have gotten like 80% right. So I think it really depends on you as a student and what your time management is like and what your skill set is. But one thing that I think we need to remember is that the test is kind of like a game in some sense, and your job is to score as many points as possible. And I say that because I wish someone had given me that advice when I was in high school, preparing for all these standardized tests, because I was the type of person who, if I didn't think it was right, I wouldn't want to move on until I thought it was perfect. And I wasn't a bad test taker, but I probably could have been more strategic when I was in high school. So that's the advice that I give my students.
Yeah. And I actually, I appreciate that. I know that for me as a test taker, I have to kind of go in order. Now, luckily with the digital test, you can go back and forth and you can flag questions and things like that now. And folks, if you haven't actually tried out the digital testing platform yet, you can actually download Blue Book on your own device as long as it's not your own Chromebook. So if it's a Windows or a Mac, and you can download it and they'll have a nice little practice test in there with you and you can see how everything functions. You can go back and forth between your reading passages, so you can flag your questions and whatnot. For me, I know that I have to go in order. Like I just have to. And because of that, that's how my mind works. So I'm doing question 1 through question 45 in that order. So it really depends on the student, and what you know your priority is. But the truth is that the real advice here between what Beth and I have said is you need to know yourself as a student and go in with a game plan. If you're like, you know what, I'm going to just see what the first reading is to see if I'm going to start there or not. That's really not the best thing to do on test day. Going into the exam with a game plan is going to actually provide you with a greater sense of comfort because you know how you're going to power through the exam itself. Excuse me. Now, Beth, I know that we're talking about multiple choice here, but because this writing question is nice and holistic, let's actually try to answer it right now. So Samantha asked, and we'll do the reading faster question in just a moment too. But Samantha asks, would we recommend pulling writing tactics from exams like AP Human Geo or AP World or any of those other exams in relation to our AP Lang exam, or should we focus on AP Lang writing tactics? What do you think about that? And then I'm going to respond to it too.
That's a really great question. Actually, I don't know that we've ever been asked that one before.
Me neither. Me neither,
really
but I have an answer for it too. But what do you think first?
Well, I know that my students who take APUSH and AP Lang at the same time have been taught to write slightly differently depending on the test. And from my experience, writing for APUSH is different than writing for AP Lang because the rubrics are similar, but they're different. Like one is a history test and one is an English test, essentially. So I would say that good writing is good writing, but you have to remember that it is a little bit of an apples and oranges situation because what might score well in history might not score well in English or vice versa. But I think stylistically, some of the things that we teach students can transfer. But I would say know your AP Lang rubrics and what your AP Lang readers are looking for Lang, and then know your, let's say you're an APUSH, know those rubrics and that kind of thing for that. So to me, they're similar but different. So I would say AP Lang, focus on the AP Lang rubrics and what readers are looking for. And you can certainly bring in outside knowledge. I love it when students bring in stuff from history class, but the writing might be different.
Hey, I just want to point out that sometimes, like when I'm looking in the chat, I feel like I'm on a crazy train. That's all I'm going to say. All right. That's all I'm going to say. But Beth, I really appreciate what you said there. I'm friends with Tom Ritchie, who has a decently popular YouTube channel for the AP histories. And Tom and I were talking once, and he told me, he said, Tim, the truth is that you don't necessarily have to be a good writer to score well on the history essays. And the truth is that that's not true in relation to the AP English essays. So I would actually encourage kids, if they're going to adopt writing techniques and apply it to another test, they should take their AP Lang writing skills and apply it to the other test and not vice versa. And the reason why is because the evaluative rubrics on the other exams are pinpointed for that particular content area, where in AP Lang, your rubrics are pinpointed towards the skills that you're supposed to develop. Because in language, AP English language, your skills are your content. As opposed to like on the history exam, did you provide your context? There's your check. Did you provide the complexity? There's your check. And so even the complexity point and the sophistication point don't match, because the sophistication point is actually a skill-based point as opposed to a content-based point. And so it's just one of those things that you kind of want to consider. If you're going to transfer your writing skills, write like an English student on the history exam as opposed to the other way around, if you're going to do that. So just a note about that. Any other things to add about that before we talk about the reading faster? Because we get this question every single year.
Yeah, no, I think we covered it. But so as far as the reading faster, this one's a tough one because I feel like I don't know, like my students who want to read faster, we practice like speed reading and skimming and that kind of thing. But I don't know that I have any like tried and true tips other than kind of practicing. Like I do a lot of things in my classroom where I give my students a prompt and I'm like, okay, pretend it's exam day, like just trying to work through some of that almost like initial fear and stuff. But my students who have said, oh, I've learned to read faster, the way they said that they learned to do it was just by practicing and learning how to speed read in a way that worked for them. But I also think that we need to be careful about wanting to read faster because I appreciate the question because you're trying to
Yeah,
make sure that you're, getting through the test, but we don't want to compromise accuracy either.
right.
And I think there's like a balance there. So what are your thoughts on reading faster?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first way that you learn to read faster is by actually reading. And I think that a lot of times students come to me and they don't want to actually fully engage with the work, but they want the score that would suggest that they're fully engaged with the work. And so I always try to just tell my students, like, hey, listen, if you don't think that you have a full mastery of AP Lang, why are you trying to argue for an A with me? You know what I mean? Like that doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. If you're willing to readily admit you're an average AP Lang student, but you want a 95, I don't understand, right? And so now all of a sudden it becomes, well, if I'm not, how do I read faster, but I don't practice reading? Well, that's like saying I don't practice soccer, but I should be on the high school soccer team. And so we have to realize that the best way to read faster is to read more because you're more used to reading and comprehending things. Okay. So that's the first thing that I want to point out. And I'm not trying to insult you all and say that you're lazy or anything like that. I'm just saying we have to have a really cognizant understanding of what our skills are and what we can do to practice for that. And one of the ways that you read faster is by reading more. But just by reading more doesn't mean that you automatically get faster because I still am a slow reader. So what a lot of people my age and in my profession can read in, 5 minutes, it's going to take me 7. It's just how it is. Okay. I am going to give you some tips about reading more critically, but the easiest tip about reading faster is try to read more from now to exam day. And I'm not just talking about reading more text messages. Find a website that you actually like. Let's say you're really into sports. Read some more ESPN articles. Say it's politics. Good. Then go to your favorite political news site and read there. Okay. But scrolling through TikTok and scrolling through your text messages is not the type of critical reading that we're actually talking about here. Another thing too, Beth, that's going to kind of tie in with this question that I'm seeing asked over here is should kids, and I know that you and I have both have different advice about this, should kids look at the stems before they read the passage?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because, and I have videos where I say this, when it was paper, I would have my students do this for both the ACT and the AP Lang test. I would have some of my students who tended to struggle with pacing, I would have them read the questions first because it allowed them to read with a purpose. And this was something that we tried. A lot of what I do with my students is here are some strategies that I want you to practice. And even if you're like, nope, I'm a great test taker, just try it. And then I let them kind of, after they've done the different techniques, pick what works for them. And for a lot of my students who struggled with pacing, reading the questions first helped, like the question stems, not the answer choices. However, I don't know that that's an effective or as effective for a digital exam. And I say
I
that because
agree.
it involve a lot more clicking and stuff. So if you go to my old videos and you're like, oh, she said read the questions first, I do think that is a valid technique. But when I was saying that, I was saying it for the paper test. I'm not saying you can't do it for digital, but I would practice it. Any of these techniques that we might mention that have helped some of our students in the past, please know 2 things. Number one, it's not a one size fits all thing because I could tell you just as many students' names who like to read the questions first, and I can give you a whole separate list of those who don't. So it's
Yep.
not a one size fits all, but
But
also,
this goes back to having that strategy going in, like knowing what you are as a test taker. And once again, you can download Blue Book yourself, folks, and take a practice AP Lang test to get a feel for it. And then you can redo it again and try doing it multiple ways to have that plan going in. Sorry for interrupting, Beth.
no, you're good. But that's exactly what I was going to say is you have to practice these techniques and do it in different ways to kind of simulate the exam because you don't want to go into the AP Lang test with a strategy that you've never tried before. Like we don't want to
Yeah.
Hail Mary on test day. Like that's not going to work usually.
Yeah, no, that's not going to work at all. And actually, Beth, I'm going to agree with you on this one. I don't think that it's appropriate anymore to read the stems before you start reading your passage. And the reason why is because they only put one multiple choice question on the screen with you at a time now. And so you're right. You're going to have to click through 15 multiple choice questions and then flip all the way back to the first one to then go back and redo it. So now I think it is more appropriate to actually just engage with the reading and then just go through your questions and know that you could skip them and skip the questions and come back, but they're going to be about that reading. And if you come in with the idea of knowing that, I'm marking my shifts. I'm looking for patterns in word connotations. I'm looking for subordinated conjunctions or complex coordinated conjunctions like however or conjunctive adverbs. Those are going to be places that are going to help you really kind of dig in there for it. And so I agree with you, Beth. Now that it's gone digital, I actually would move away from reading the question stems first because I think it's going to be a significantly bigger waste of time, even though it's just a few clicks away. One good thing, though, is that this year there are 4 answer choices instead of 5 for each multiple choice question. So I noticed that when my kids took a practice exam in February, that they finished a lot more quickly because there was one less answer that they had to work with here.
I noticed that too, actually, because I've done the same mock exams for the past 3-4 years now. And my students finished probably on average about 5 minutes more quickly than I anticipated based on the previous years. So the 4 answer choices, I think, is helpful.
Yeah. I am going to address one question that just came in before some other ones that have already come in first, though. And it was the idea of, is it better or worse than paper, the digital exam? And folks, the answer is it's different. But one of the things that I want to point out is one of the reasons why the College Board really, I don't want to say rushed to produce all digital exams, but moved more quickly than I think the timeline had anticipated, wasn't just because of the test leak last year. It was also because kids who were taking the digital exam consistently scored higher than the paper exam. Like it was just consistent. So even kids from the same demographics, when they were compared, like same demographics, same everything, right? The kids who were taking the exam digitally were consistently scoring higher. And so they were like, you know what? We're trying not to put other kids at a disadvantage for whatever reason. And I don't mean like for whatever reason they were thinking about that. I mean, they're trying not to put kids at a disadvantage for any reason. And so they were like, we're going to actually unload the digital exam or release the digital exam and require that instead of having the option here on out. Now, I am an exam purist. I wish it were still on paper, but I also have to recognize that the data does suggest pretty consistently that kids test better when they do the exam digitally because they can typically write more for their essays. On average, even kids who don't really know how to type can produce like 100 to 150 more words just by typing instead of handwriting. So now I saw this little conspiracy theory here that says it's way cheaper for the College Board to go digital, and maintaining the databases for that is not necessarily entirely cheaper. I'm just going to toss that out there. A lot of times people think the College Board is in it for the money, and I'm not going to say yes or no to that, but I also know that I've worked in conjunction with them for a few things. I know that when I was skeptical in relation to those conspiracy theories before I was involved with them, has kind of been, I've toned it down a notch. That's how I can word it there. Okay. Good. So somebody asked about AP World History multiple choice questions. Beth, can we just say that we're not talking about AP World History? Are you cool with that?
Yeah, I don't know enough about it at all.
Gotcha. So before we talk about this question about differentiating between answer choices, I'm going to just ask that I could talk about one more element of reading the multiple choice passages before we talk about differentiating between multiple choice questions. Beth, are you okay with that? All right.
Yeah.
So I'm going to share my screen here real quick. Folks, this is sorry, let me get this over here. This is linked up in the description below this video. Okay. You'll notice it's just a little, it is just a little worksheet here that has playlists about how to write rhetorical analysis from the beginning to the end and some multiple choice tips here. And when you're learning to read rhetorically, these are 5 questions that I give my students to start reading for at the beginning of the year. And what happens is I say, when you look at anything, when you read anything, when you have a conversation with any person in your life, I want you to always be asking yourself these questions because you want to get yourself thinking in these terms at all times. When you're having a conversation, say, all right, someone's speaking to me based on what he or she is saying. Where is this person coming from? What does this person value? What does this person believe? Based on what he or she is saying, what does that person think that I, as the audience, believe, value, and need? Okay? Based on what he or she is saying, what am I supposed to experience emotionally in response to what that person is saying to me? Okay? based on what that speaker is trying to argue with me. And I don't mean like you're fighting with the person, but just even having a conversation based on the person's argument and what we're talking about. Why are we talking about it right here and right now? And then also, when the person is talking to me, I need to start saying, how does what this person is saying right then relate to what the person said before or what's about to come after? And the reason why I give my kids these 5 questions is because every multiple choice question, or almost every multiple choice question that you see on your AP Lang exam is some sort of variant of those 5 questions. Because these 5 questions are, what's the argument? What's the function of what the language following the argument is? Why is it important to talk about it now? Tell me about the speaker. Tell me about the audience. Tell me about the effect. And that's all of rhetoric here. And so I have my kids memorize these questions and then start, or I encourage my kids to memorize these questions and start reading everything with these in mind. So if you're driving by a billboard, start thinking about these questions. When you're arguing with your parents next time, start thinking about these questions. When you're reading something in class, start thinking about these questions, because every time you see a question on your multiple choice, it's probably going to be some variant of what's here. And if you're used to reading with these questions in mind, then you're going to be able to apply that directly to how you read anything, especially on exam day. So you can access this sheet, like I said, right down in the description, right down there for that. Beth, anything you want to add before we go on to the how do we deal with the multiple choice answers, or actually talk about the writing multiple choice perhaps a little bit too?
No, I think we should move on.
All right. So Beth, you have a kid come in and a kid says, hey, look it, how do I differentiate between the correct answers and the incorrect answers when I'm kind of stuck in things like that? What do you recommend for that?
So one of the things that I have students do is to use the process of elimination, which I know students are taught probably back in like early elementary school. But there's going to be, in my opinion, at least 2 of the 4 now that are like throwaway answers. And it's probably because of a couple different reasons. It could be because the answer choice just literally is not true of the passage, like it's a total misread or something. Or it could be true, like as in it said it somewhere in the passage, but it's not actually answering the question being asked. So usually if students have read the passage, they can eliminate a couple answers. And so that's where I think a lot of students struggle, though, is they say, oh, I can get it down to 2 answers, but then how do I pick the right one? And I think one of the things that I like to have students do is look closely at the wording and also make sure they really go back to the question being asked, because usually there's one answer that's going to be better suited to that question because it's either more precise or it's true of the passage. And that's the other thing too, is I have my students go back to the passage. I know it feels like it's adding an extra step, but if the question is something about like, what is the writer doing in paragraph 2? I know they wouldn't word it like that, but I don't want them to answer that from memory, because I want them to go back to the passage and actually look at paragraph 2 if that's what they're being asked about. And so many students, I think sometimes because they're maybe stressed about the timing, they try to answer it from memory and then they fall for those answer traps more. So I guess top things would be process of elimination, know how they create distractor answers, which I think you could kind of elaborate on as well.
I'm going to cover that in a minute. Yeah.
Yeah. And then also go back to the passage, because when you try to do it from memory, you're more likely to fall for these like second best answers as opposed to the best answer, at least in my experience.
Shout out to Dr. Mazzoni, by the way. I think there's a long E sound at the end of Mazzoni. Please forgive me if that's not the case. Maybe it's Dr. Mazzone, but I think it's Mazzoni. And yeah, so Beth, I really appreciate that, because, you know, the process of elimination is key. And I think the kids know that, but especially if we have purposeful process of elimination, that's going to help us on test day a lot. And I do like this advice here from Cheyenne, who says that Mr. Dupree says, like, hey, do the 2-2-1 here. So narrow it down to 2 and then figure out which one of those 2 is correct. Now, I do have a video, and it's also linked on that kind of tip sheet that's linked in the description down below for you all. But I have I have a video about multiple choice, but it's based on the 5 answer multiple choice, but it doesn't matter, because all that changes is that it goes from 5 to 4 answers. Like, that's it. The advice is still the same. One of the things that you could do when you're trying to narrow it down, when you're trying to narrow down the answers is knowing how lead distractors typically function. Now, what I'm going to tell you is there's no set formula that the College Board gives its test development people where it's like, when you're writing incorrect answers, make sure you do blank. However, I have read tons of College Board multiple choice. I have written tons of my own multiple choice and for perfection learning in the textbooks and stuff like that. And I have noticed a pattern in most of the wrong answers. Okay. So I have my own students write their own multiple choice and I make them write wrong answers. And all of the wrong answers that they write have to fall into the typical patterns of a lead distractor. So this is not dogma. This does not come from the College Board. This is just something I have noticed over the years. When you narrow it down to what you think is the correct answer and potentially what's called the lead distractor, that's an answer that seems right, but it's not right. They typically follow a few different patterns. The first one is there's something correct in the answer, but there's also something that's incorrect. And rather than just knowing that that something is incorrect, you actually think that you miscomprehended the piece. And so you're like, oh, maybe I misread that. Okay. And that makes you challenge your reading comprehension. And we want to make sure that we don't do that. Because if you notice that there's something incorrect in the answer and you notice that the other answer is entirely correct, just because an answer is half correct doesn't mean it's correct at all. It means it's actually entirely wrong. So half correct is still wrong. But that's one of the things that you want to look for. The next common lead distractor is a answer that has correct information in it, but not for that particular question. So there's a question that's asked, the answer, you read it and you're like, that has to be the correct answer because I saw that in the reading that I just had. Yeah, you might have seen that information in the reading, but it's not for that particular question. So don't fall for that trick, okay? So we've got the half correct, we've got the, we've got the half correct answer. And another lead distractor technique that happens a decent amount is the answer. You can reason yourself into it because it's so vague. And you're like, well, I guess maybe this could possibly be blah, blah, blah. And once you start getting into the, I think I could fit this answer into that question, that probably means that you're straining a little too hard because the answer's too vague. And those seem to be the most common lead distractors, or the common qualities of lead distractors. There is a fourth quality that I totally forgot right now, but it's absolutely in my multiple choice tip video. So please forgive me for forgetting that. But that's going to help you a lot when it comes to having really pointed process of elimination and thinking about, okay, I know that these are typically how these lead distractors are made. So now I'm going to try to make sure I don't fall for that. All right. More questions here about multiple choice before we move on. Beth, did you see anything in the chat here that we haven't addressed yet about multiple choice before we move to essay stuff?
I was going to say, I think we've covered just about everything, and perhaps in the interest of time, we might want to move on, but I think we've covered all the multiple choice stuff.
I do anticipate
one that I see that was, how long do you recommend staying on a question you're unsure about before you move on? And that was from Julie Ellenberg.
Yeah, Beth, you answer that one, then I'll take care of it.
I would say, I mean, it's really hard because it depends on like how far into the test you are and who you are as a student and stuff. So I would say probably like no more than like 2 to 3 minutes maximum, but obviously the situation kind of depends on a variety of factors too. But I would ask yourself, like, do I really need to be answering this question right now, or should I flag it and come back to it? Because I feel like it could go either way. So some questions are more time consuming than others, but at the same time, I would ask yourself, is this the best use of my time right now? Or should I just come back to it if there's time? I would say definitely if you've narrowed it down to 2 answers, maybe pick which one you're leaning toward and then flag it and come back to it if you need to. Like, don't leave any question blank. But I certainly would be leery of spending more than a couple minutes on a question, like 2 to 3, because I think sometimes we get caught up in that, we lose track of time.
Yeah, I agree. That's 100% true. Honestly, if I don't necessarily know a question within about a minute, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to flag it and I'll come back to it after. And I'm going to work with questions that I do know, or questions that I'm ready to go on there. Someone asked, should they guess if they have very little time left? Absolutely. And actually, I really like this question from Jacqueline Brown. It says, one thing I'm concerned about is whether the 4 options as opposed to the 5 has improved the students' multiple choice scores significantly, and whether this will impact the thresholds for achieving a 5, a 4, and etc. Let me just kind of explain how the move to 4 answers was discussed with me. Okay, when they had 5 answers and they moved to 4, the College Board, people like to say that the College Board makes things easier, or the College Board does, like, people charge the College Board with a lot of things, but you all have to recognize that colleges have to agree. The vested colleges in the College Board have to agree to changes that they make. And so the way it was presented to me was that in moving from 5 to 4 chances, that there's no statistical difference in understanding if a student can exhibit a skill if there are 5 questions as 5 answers as opposed to 4. And so what they realized is that the only difference that 5 answers creates as opposed to 4 in terms of understanding if the student has the skill is whether or not a student can read faster. And because the test is not about if kids can read faster or read more in a smaller amount of time, they chose to go from 5 answers to 4. Now, does that mean that they're going to change their cut scores and things like that? I don't have a clue. I doubt that's the case, only because I've seen what's happened in AP US history, and they've moved from 5 to 4 answers. And actually, it's now, I hate to use this word because it's the wrong word, but it's easier to get a qualifying score in AP US history now with the new rubrics and whatnot. But we're not going to be able to know about correlations with those numbers until the test has been out for a few years. But I do know that they cut or they seemingly cut that 5th answer because it actually tested a skill that was not meant to be tested on the AP exam, because it's not an actual English content skill. It's just a reading speed skill. Okay. Good. So let's see. Good. All right. How big of a focus? I don't have a clue about the college admissions types of stuff. That's for the college. Thanks for putting that in there, but I don't know. Good. All right. All right, Beth. Let's talk about the writing multiple choice for just 1 second here. What's your best advice? Because the writing multiple choice is a little different than the reading multiple choice. So in 2 minutes, what do you have to say about it?
Okay, so if you're not sure what the writing multiple choice is, basically the exam is set up where there are essentially 5 passages. The first 2 are reading. Those are longer. They have about 10 to 13 questions. It's the comprehension stuff that we've been talking about. The last 3 passages, so passages 3, 4, and 5, are writing questions. And they will say something to the effect of, this is a draft above it. Look for the word draft. And so it's a little less than half the questions out of the 45. And these questions, your job is basically to think like an editor. So the passage was written with errors on purpose, and your job is to basically make revisions. And a lot of my students tend to find these questions a little bit easier and more comfortable, to the point where some of my students actually prefer to start with this part of the test. My students who don't have a problem with starting midway through. Some of my students don't like to jump ahead. But basically, these questions are ones where you're going to be asked for the right transition word, or you might have to pick the sentence that's the most engaging opening and things like that. So your job is essentially to be an editor and to revise. And so I think the process of elimination and all that will still work, but I think it's important to understand that it's a totally different skill set than the reading multiple choice.
Yeah, and I want to just talk about studying for that for just a moment. If you want to study for the writing types of questions that you'll see, one of the things that I recommend is that you all have access to AP exams from 1999 through 2024. And what happens here is they also give you access to student samples. And if you go to student samples that after 2019 score a 130, or if you go to student samples that score a 120, or before 2019 when they used the 9-point rubric, if you look at student samples that scored a 5 or a 6, I would encourage you to try to rewrite those samples into better papers. And the reason why is because rewriting those arguments or rewriting those synthesis papers or rewriting those rhetorical analyses is actually a very similar task to what you're being asked to do in the writing multiple choice questions. It's, hey, this communicates something, but it can communicate something more effectively. Can you go do it? And in fact, Beth, you and I created a writing workbook with Brandon Abden last year that actually requires kids to do this at the end. It gives kids very clear strategies. Hey, the writer wants to do this, go try this out for them, but we just don't give those multiple choice answers. And that's a perfection learning book, folks. It's super cheap. I'm not trying to sell it to you right now. I'm just letting you know that it's out there. If you were to go to Perfection Learning, how to write for the AP exam, it's got a lot of those kind of revision moments in there to help kids get used to that, okay? And Lexi, if you want to find a link to that and drop that in the chat, that's perfectly fine. Thank you very much.
I think I've got one if Lexi doesn't have one.
Okay, right. For anybody that's interested in that, like I said, it's like $15. But like I said, I also don't need you all to think that I'm trying to sell you that right now. I'm not. Okay, we have resources. We have some paid resources, but this conversation is free. And one of the free ways to do what we do in that book is to just go to the College Board website, look at the arguments and synthesis papers and rhetorical analyses, and say, I'm going to choose one that did not score the highest, and I'm going to try to rewrite it to make it better, because that's a lot of the thinking that needs to happen with that process. Okay, Beth, let's actually start with rhetorical analysis stuff that will then also start with the next time around, because we've got about 14 more minutes here. And I want to know, what is the question that we get asked the most often about rhetorical analysis? Because I'm pretty sure that you and I get it more than anything else.
Oh goodness, now you put me on the spot. Is it the one about like what's a rhetorical choice, or what are the top ones?
Yeah, or do I list my devices in my thesis? Our choices devices, all of that kind of stuff. Let's actually try to address this right now, with about a month and a half left before the exam.
Okay, so first of all, let's figure out the difference between a device and a choice, but just know that both are accepted on the exam. However, Tim and I both advocate for rhetorical choices. And Tim actually gives a really good analogy of this in a lot of his videos. Do you want to do the device choice analogy now, or do you want to just
Which one? Which one?
The, like, a device is like your phone, but a choice is like addressed.
Gotcha. Yeah. Right. So actually, I mean, Beth, you're right. We should do that. Okay, folks. I know that I'm not necessarily live here, but because we're about 17 seconds ahead. But folks, I want you to think about devices that are in your house, and I'm going to ask that you toss them right in the chat. So for me, I'm going to put in the chat a device that I have even right on my desk right here. So I'm going to ask that you toss a device in the chat. It's going to be awkwardly silent for an extra 17 seconds as this catches up.
And it could be anything, so be creative, like microwave,
right.
toaster.
Yeah. Well, Beth, put something in the chat here while we wait awkwardly.
And with the delay, they're going to be like, what is this?
I know, right? There we go. Yeah, laptop. Okay. Apparently Andrew's tempted to cheat on the test. Andrew,
Please don't do it, buddy.
It'll just lead to like certain,
Okay, can I just like address that super quickly though? As guys, please do not go on social media after the test and post content about what's on the test. Like, not on TikTok, not on Reddit. Please don't do it. Just we'll get into why maybe later, but like, just please don't violate academic integrity.
Yeah, honestly.
Vague memes are one thing, actual content is another.
I actually even encourage my kids to stay away from the vague memes too, because I just can't. I'm like, you cannot cancel your test scores for your entire school because you decided you wanted to be like that. But anyway, check this out: lava lamp, water bottle, phone, fridge, dryer, fork, stove, dishwasher, can of Dr. Pepper, calculator, phone, TV, phone, toothbrush. Someone with a toothbrush on his or her desk. That's pretty awesome. I like that tablet, Lexi. That's pretty awesome. Anyway, nonetheless, all of these particular items have something in common. They're nouns. Okay. So I bring this up because a rhetorical device, right, I asked you to put a device in the chat, and you all put nouns. So if a device is by definition a noun, a rhetorical device will also be a noun. Okay. Now, with that being said, I'm going to ask that you think about a choice that you made. Okay. For a choice that you made earlier today. And I'm going to put one in here to brush my teeth. There we go. And Beth, I'm going to ask that you put a choice that you made in the chat as well. And
Okay.
Lexi, please do that too, because apparently somebody wants to know. Somebody just was like, Lexi, I'd like to know what your contribution is here.
Yeah,
And
y'all,
I
she's
thought
our moderator.
I
She's
know, like
contributing plenty.
owning this, right?
Lexi's choice is deleting comments.
Yeah, seriously. Oh, great. I'm glad that somebody has a bidet in his or her house. Okay, awesome. Thanks for telling us. TMI. But Beth, did you put something in the chat there?
Yeah, I just put driving home because we were in Dallas this
Oh,
morning.
yeah. Good. Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So we have to eat, to drink, to wake up, to go to the Chinese embassy meeting, to drink, to take a nap. Oh, I do like napping a lot. To walk outside. Awesome. So notice, folks, that when I asked you to put a choice in the chat, you actually put verbs in there. Now, the reason why this is so important is because when you're on your AP Lang exam or you're taking it, your standard language for your rhetorical analysis prompt is going to say, analyze the rhetorical choices that the author makes in order to convey his or her message. Okay. It asks you to analyze the rhetorical choices. Choices are intrinsically verbs. Now, that doesn't mean that you can't mention devices, but you have to tie them with verbs. So I see a lot of kids say the author uses a metaphor. And I'm like, it would be way better if you said the author contrasts this with this, if the metaphor is meant to contrast. Getting those verbs is key in helping you understand rhetorical analysis better. So that's one of the things that I use to show my kids that, rhetorical devices are nouns, rhetorical choices are verbs. Now, if I were to say, Tim contrasts the positive, or let's do Cesar Chavez real quick. Cesar Chavez contrasts the negative outcomes of violence with the positive outcomes of nonviolence. Good. I have the choice, contrast. I also have rhetorical devices. What are the nouns there? The outcomes, the negative outcomes of violence, the positive outcomes of nonviolence. So I'm still writing about rhetorical devices, but you have a choice there, which is that verb, okay? And if you want more instruction on that, please go to Beth Hall's channel. She has an entire video about choices as opposed to devices. If you look at my how to write a rhetorical analysis, I address that there too. Okay. And then Alexi, apparently you just need to contribute some more here. I don't know. I think that you're doing a great job though. But anyway, Beth, I appreciate you having me bring up that particular incident as an example, because we have to realize that choices are founded in the verb. Now, Beth, let me ask this question though. What if I write a thesis that says so-and-so uses a simile, a metaphor, and pathos in order to blah, blah, blah? Will that get the thesis point?
It will. It definitely will. But I think we just agree that there are stronger ways to say it. And so one of the things that you and I both talk about in some of our videos is essentially taking the device and turning it into that active choice. Like, for instance, okay, let's take pathos, because when I was an AP reader for rhetorical analysis, I saw so many essays that were one paragraph about logos, one about ethos, one about pathos. And it was like,
Right.
there was so much else that they could have talked about, but they latched onto those appeals. So for pathos, I will ask my students, okay, first of all, step one is we don't want to say uses pathos. I want them to
Right.
at least say appeals to, and then whatever the specific emotion is, or evokes a sense of, and then whatever the emotion is, that's going to be stronger. But really the question is, okay, what is creating that emotional appeal? So let's say it's perhaps like the description. The vivid description is, or the detail. I tend not to like to use imagery in nonfiction, but that's just probably personal preference. But anyway, that's going to be creating that appeal. So maybe I would have the student focus on how the author vividly describes something to evoke a sense of that emotion. And then you've got two things working in tandem. You've got this rhetorically accurate verb plus the appeal. And there's more to work with there. So it's not that we're saying don't use nouns. We're also not saying don't write about appeals, but there are ways to do so more effectively.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually just put a video in the chat about how to do that. And Beth, if you have a video on your channel for that, please put that in there too. Sorry, I have to just write a comment here. So anyway, nonetheless, yeah, and that's right. We have to kind of just really dig into getting past this idea of uses. And one of the reasons why we want to think about that is because rhetorical analysis, and in terms of understanding what you're trying to do, you're trying to articulate how an author built an argument. Now, imagine I went to my contractor for my house and I said, "How did you build my house?" And he was like, "Yeah, I used a hammer, wood, nails, and concrete." That's kind of like the rhetorical analysis thesis statements we get, right, Beth? Where it's like so-and-so just uses these things. Well, if I actually decided to juggle a hammer and some nails and some wood, I'm still using them, but is that building a house? Absolutely not. I need my contractor to say, well, I poured the concrete and then I placed the wood on top of the foundation and then I hammered the nails through the joists so that the house would stand up. Notice that the real meaning on how that conveys that I built my house is found in the verbs that I then tied to the nouns that I had there.
Absolutely. There's a couple questions I think we can answer sort of quickly. So one was, are there certain rhetorical choices that we should avoid if we find them? I wouldn't say that there's ones that you should avoid, but there is one thing that I do tell my students, and that is if you see a rhetorical choice, but you really can't write a full paragraph about it, in general, you should look for something else. And I say this because there might be the teeny tiniest illusion, and students will be like, oh, I know that. But then they go to write the paragraph about it and they can't really say much. And then it becomes underdeveloped and their paragraphs are uneven. So I have seen that where students have seen maybe like less prominent choices and they maybe were ignoring the rest of it. So it's not that there's stuff that you shouldn't write about, but I would ask yourself as you're selecting your choices for your thesis that are ultimately going to become the main ideas for your essay. Is this something that I can write about well? We also both encourage that students analyze chronologically. So what we mean by that is to follow the writer or speaker's line of reasoning. I don't like to see essays where it's kind of like a scavenger hunt. Because for instance, just because you might have studied something in class with repetition, it doesn't mean that there's always going to be repetition. So don't go looking for the repetition and don't go trying to find it throughout the whole passage. Kind of divide it up like those shifts we were talking about for multiple choice. Look for those shifts and ask yourself, okay, what's happening in the beginning, middle, and end, or what's happening in the first half and the second half, and follow that line of reasoning. It's going to lead to a stronger essay. And also one more quick tip, because this might help. One of the questions I get asked a lot is, what do I do if I don't see any rhetorical choices? And there are some passages that are from previous exams where I could see how the choices that we tend to teach in class maybe are not readily visible. So what do you do in these instances? Remember that, as Tim already said, a choice is something that you do. So ask yourself, what is the writer doing? And sometimes there are verbs that are maybe not like compares or repeats, but sometimes a good verb could be, let's say, acknowledge or justify or something like that. So if you can answer the question of what is the writer doing, then you are analyzing a rhetorical choice. So if you don't see any obvious rhetorical choices, don't freak out. There's still something for you to write about.
Yeah, and actually, if you look in the chat on the YouTube, if you're watching, if you have the YouTube live up there, that's and it's muted. I just put some choice verbs in there. When kids are trying to label rhetorical choices, here are some key verbs to fall back to, right? Oh, I noticed that here the author is describing such and such. Here the author, actually the verb exposes should probably be on the effect side of verbs. I'm sorry about that, folks. But the author narrates, the author incorporates, the author includes, the author refutes, the author exemplifies. So that's a great way to kind of get used to saying, I'm looking at some text. What's the author doing here? And you've got a nice little verb list right here. But you also have to answer why when you do a rhetorical analysis. So a lot of times kids could say, oh, the author presents, this, and then they just put a period. But we really need the why connected to it. So when you're looking for the rhetorical effect, you can really look at these verbs that I put here in the chat, like, oh, the author narrates this really tragic story in order to evoke a sense of sadness or sympathy from the audience member. Or the author narrates, a short anecdote from his or her childhood to reiterate blah, blah, blah. So what happens here is the verbs that I just put in there for you all, some of them are better choice verbs. So you could describe what the author is doing in the text. And then you have the effect verbs, which help you get to the why. And when you write a rhetorical analysis essay, you're trying to say, I noticed that the author is doing this in the text, and here's why the author is doing it. And the effect verbs can get you to that why. So if you could, even if you at the very least could say, I noticed the author is using a metaphor, although I think it's better to say something else. If you say uses a metaphor, then we're going to say good in order to showcase what, or in order to promote what idea. Or let's say you see some parallel structure and you want to say the author uses parallel structure. Now, I wouldn't let my kids write that, but that doesn't matter to me. Let's just be a little bit simple here. Uses parallel structure. Well, parallel structure is a type of repetition. And every time something is repeated, it's meant to emphasize. So we would say the writer uses parallel structure to emphasize, get that why out there. And if you have these effect verbs, it's going to help you.
Someone just asked if AI is an effective tool for scoring their own practice essays. And I think it's very inconsistent in my own experience. I have tried it just to see, and I've had to refine my search terms and things. So I would say you're probably better off, if possible, sitting down with your teacher and going over the rubric and getting feedback or comparing it to the College Board samples that are available. I'm not saying that AI is never accurate, but I've seen it be really hit or miss. And so I would try to kind of use your rubric and look at some student samples instead. I think that would be more accurate.
Yeah. A couple of things here. I agree that I think AI is inconsistent. I actually am in discussion with an AI company, though, that does not generate student essays. So that's why I told the company I would talk to them. That is really working to produce something that is going to be something that I think I will be able to suggest that I support, but it's not going to be ready for this year. So because of that, we're going to just kind of keep that as is. I don't think AI is ready there yet to get a decently good enough assessment. But I also want to point out that you should really consider doing like a self-assessment. Now, one little sales pitch here. I have a complete AP review guide, an exam review guide that's listed down below. And one of the things that's part of that, it goes through the entire course, like the whole thing. It's one of the only things that I charge for. Almost everything I do is free. But one of the things that it does is it turns the rubric into questions you can ask yourself. And if you can become self-reflective about the rubric with questions, that's actually going to be a better way to assess how your essays do than let some AI-generated response possibly do it the right way. Because I took the rubric and I turned it into questions that you could ask yourself there. Okay? So that's that. Now, Beth, I'm going to let you have your final say and your final piece. Alexi, if you want to say anything too, I got to pick up my son from hockey practice, so we do have to wrap this up. Our next one, maybe we could stay a little bit later. But Beth, what do you have?
Okay, so we barely got into rhetorical analysis, so hopefully
I figured that we would overlap to the next time about really writing the essay, but I wanted to kind of dabble in it because we were thinking about rhetorical reading. Sorry, Beth.
Yeah, no problem. Someone asked about topic sentences. I'm just going to put a video link in the chat. So that's one thing I hope students know is that Tim and I have both been on YouTube for like over 5 years now. I think I started back in 2019. And so while we don't necessarily have the same editing styles as we did back then, please don't judge us too harshly for our really old content.
Right.
Seriously. And even his stuff's way fancier than mine now anyway. But the point is that we try to offer really good information based on our experience as AP teachers. And so my recommendation would be to, if there's certain things that you're struggling with, you have like 6 weeks until the exam, be strategic with your studying. So if you are trying to earn a certain point on the rubric, like let's say you're trying to go from a 3 to a 4 in row B, focus your attention on that. Like we want to make sure that we're giving you tips to help you be successful and to understand the different components of the exam. But now's the time to really kind of start thinking about the exam. And I say this to say that we have videos on a lot of these topics as well if you're looking to kind of supplement your learning. But also I want to encourage students to trust the process because you've been in the course presumably for like the year. I know some people are on a half-year block schedule, but you have had that foundation. So we're glad that you're here and we're glad that you're asking questions and we're glad that you're willing to learn. So please come back and join us for our other lives. But I think the big thing right now, if you're looking to kind of start studying for the exam, is I would be very honest with yourself about your strengths and weaknesses and make a targeted practice plan. I think that's kind of what I've seen students do with success is this is the time to be reflective and just kind of think about how can I move forward. Tim gave some really great tips earlier about, how to improve with the writing multiple choice and things like that. So if we gave tips today that you feel like you could put into practice before the next live that we have together, go ahead and start doing that. But yeah, I guess that's it. Is just thank you all for being here and asking great questions. But please know that we do have other resources to help. So if we didn't get to your question today, we'll try to get to it the next live, or we probably have a video about it too.
Right. And also, there is that free link, the free linked Google Doc down below with playlists for rhetorical analysis and whatnot. And Beth, like I said, if you send over anything that you want me to put there. Oh, good. Lexi just put it in the chat there as well. And so
I put both playlists in the chat for anybody who would like them for rhetorical analysis, both Garden of English and Coach Hall Writes.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lexi. I appreciate what you do. Folks, I did put the dates in for our next lives, April 10th, April 24th, and May 13th. On April 10th, we're going to cover more rhetorical analysis. We'll get into synthesis. And then on April 24th, we'll do some argument stuff with Katie Storms. And then on May 13th, I'll probably see if Katie wants to join us on the 13th as well. And we'll have 4 cooks in the kitchen. But folks, one last thing that I want to point out is that Beth and I, we're really good friends. And we're both successful AP Lang teachers. But your teachers are too, first of all. We're just willing to go on YouTube because we're crazy. But nonetheless, on top of that, Beth and I do things differently. And some things that Beth does might resonate with you better. Some things that I do might resonate with you better. Or some things that your teacher does that's a little bit different than we do might resonate with you more. All of that is okay. We're here to try to just give you some study tips of things that you can look at and try to support you as you navigate what works for you. In life, I don't need you to be a cookie cutter. I need you to be you. So when you're like, I like what Beth does here. I like what my teacher does here. I like what Tim does here. Then pick and choose and create the best you. We are rooting for you. We are rooting for your success. We're honored that you would even come and listen to us as we give you some test taking strategies. And we really appreciate your time. And shout out to Ms. Bishop again before we sign up. And yes, these will be posted right after. All right, Beth, I think I'm going to say bye. Lexi, do you have anything you want to add?
No, I think you've pretty much covered everything. I mean, I saw a couple of questions that had come up earlier regarding whether or not the multiple choice question tips could work for the SAT. And as somebody whose school actually uses the SAT as the state assessment, and we are in the process of prepping for that next week, all of those tips and tricks are 100% usable for the SAT as well. I use the same strategies with my non-AP students for those reading passages, and they are extremely helpful.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad you know, because I don't really work with the SAT very much at all. So I appreciate that. And Beth is our ACT person. So that's that. All right. Listen, I appreciate you all. I'm going to close down this Zoom, which is going to close down this live stream. Thank you all so much for your time. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.